What if Naruto was the queen of Sona? Sitri Chapter 2. Naruto. The Kitsune of Dreams by Mythos Kyubi 777. Chapter 2. The Landing PT-1XXX. Last time, Naruto was pulled away from his universe after killing Sasuke Uchiha by the Ouroboros dragon goddess, Ophis. He appeared in the office of Sona Sitri, and was immediately resurrected by her queen piece, which had seemed to mutate before he arrived. After he was healed, conversations broke out, and he was tested by Sona. He had slain 20 stray devils, while being watched by Sona, Tsubaki, Momo, and Sona's mother and sister, Emilia and Seraphal. Now, Emilia watched as her youngest daughter fidgeted slightly. She was still waiting for the young lady to tell her what was wrong. It would take a few moments, as she knew that both of her daughters had their own ways of explaining things. She sat before Sona's desk, in front of the girl so that she wouldn't startle her. Sona sighed after a minute, and then proceeded to explain how she felt. When I made that rule about the marriage contract, I didn't just put it as a written rule. She fidgeted a little more, and drew her eyes to the desk. I made a magical vow, she said, which drew a gasp from Emilia. What kind of vow? Emilia asked, after letting that sink into her mind. Sona blushed slightly, before replying. I vowed that even if the one who beat me in chess at least 3 times, without fluking or getting lucky, that even if he was weak, I would find him attractive. Emilia hummed in thought, and replied, and now, you know that the one who beat you is easily above Lord Lucifer in power. She poured herself a cup of tea from the kettle that Naruto had left there. Sona nodded, before continuing, and that he is skilled enough in combat. But what really got me tonight was his tone. It was cold, and promised certain death to those strays. It lit a fire inside of me, much like Ne-sama's diamond dust spell. Emilia chuckled slightly. The both of you always had a strange appreciation for ice magic. Sona sighed, and looked down at her desk. You know why. We are too vested in our intelligence, to be concerned with social interactions, or feeling the warmth of such things. Even Ne-sama is like that, despite her personality quirks. Sona chuckled after saying that, and turned her eyes back up. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as she saw another being in the shadows by the door. Emilia saw her eyes narrow, and turned to look at what Sona was looking at. She didn't see anything, but felt like they were being watched. What do you see, Sona? She asked after a moment. Sona harumphed, and responded while still looking into the shadows. Have you ever heard of creatures called shades? The creature seemed to disappear after she asked that. Emilia turned back to Sona, and fidgeted. Hi, I have. Why? Sona sighed, and turned back to her mother. Naruto has a contract with Limbo. He can summon them, for use in spying and gathering intel. He can apparently summon them as guards as well. Emilia seemed to be paralyzed for a moment, her eyes widened, and her breath hitched. You are certain? She asked after a few minutes. Sona heard the nervousness in Emilia's tone, and frowned. Hi, is it a problem? She asked, and nearly jumped when they heard Naruto chuckle. It's not so much of a problem for us, it's just that they are extremely curious assholes. Naruto said, as he appeared from the leftmost bookcase. Almost like he walked straight out of the shadows again. Emilia did jump, and gasped at the small scare. She turned her head to the right, to see him. I didn't even sense him. How the hell does he do that? She mentally asked. Naruto smiled, and answered her unasked question. We of the Anbu are trained to become insensible, and to move from the shadows. As though we are a part of them. Not many can do this, even in our ranks, but I was the best my village has had in nearly a century. He then looked at Sona. What would you have done with the remains of the strays? Sona furrowed her brow in confusion, while looking at his eyes. What do you mean, Naruto? Naruto sighed, and explained. We shinobi are taught to not only kill, but to loot the corpses for anything that can be of use. Those strays didn't have any gear, but they did have a few other things that can be useful for rituals. Poisons, bones and organs, blood, the list goes on for a little while. He then asked again. What would you have done with them? Sona closed her eyes, and rubbed her forehead. Collect them, if you can. It would be a good thing to tell the devil race that strays have mystical ingredients in their bodies. Would these also appear in us? She asked after giving him the okay. Naruto hummed, and looked up to the ceiling. It's possible, though I am certain only blood would be a decent enough ingredient from you all. The key to them having more ingredients is the fact that they allowed the power to corrupt them to the point that they change. He rubbed his chin for a minute, before continuing. It's not something I would tell the rest of the devils about. Unless if you can really trust them, they could try to exterminate you, along with every stray. He said, before turning to leave. I'll collect anything that could be useful. Good evening. He then walked right into the shadows again, and disappeared. Amelia sighed, and turned to look at Sona once more. That's going to be common with him around, isn't it? Sona nodded, and turned her eyes back towards the desk. Naruto's room, 5:30. Naruto sighed as he stopped meditating. It hadn't taken long for him to collect the ingredients from the stray devil corpses. It wasn't even much of a challenge to find which ingredient went to which practice. Some magic requires certain ingredients, but the fact that most here don't know that is vexing. His thoughts stopped for a little while, and he decided it was time to properly explore the area he now lived in. So, he stood and dressed himself, before heading towards the entryway. His senses told him that Amelia, Seraphol, Sona, and Tsubaki were awake. Tsubaki was heading towards the entrance hall, and appeared to be getting ready for something. I suppose I should tell someone that I'll be exploring for a while. Might as well tell the one closest to the entrance, he thought, before jumping down from the second-story walkway. His leap and his landing were silent. Not even the air was displaced by his waist cloak, and the floor didn't even groan at the sudden shift in weight. He quickly gazed around the entrance hall, and spotted Tsubaki putting a different pair of shoes on. She wore an outfit that, although he could not recognize, he could easily tell that it was for exercising. She wore a blue track jacket, with matching blue track pants that had a black stripe going up the sides. She also wore a dark purple t-shirt. Since the jacket wasn't closed, he could easily see it. Her glasses were the same as she always wore, and he could sense a small bit of mana holding them in place. Her shoes were standard running shoes, with white soles, and a light blue material for the main body of them. The laces were dark purple, like her shirt. She did not notice him until he spoke, his voice making her jump slightly and turn to him. I will be heading out to properly map the area. In other words, I will be exploring. Thought I should let someone know. Tsubaki calmed after a few moments, and nodded. Very well, just please remember these words. The humans know nothing of the supernatural world. Devils and the like are only myths to them. Most don't even know that magic actually exists. She untensed after saying that, before continuing. You will need to hide your tails and ears. Otherwise, questions will be asked. Naruto nodded, and closed his eyes for a moment. It took a small amount of time, but his tails disappeared, followed by his ears. Tsubaki nodded, as he opened his eyes again. She could not see it under his sunglasses, but his eyes also fell under a type of illusion. They changed back to blue, or at least apparently. She turned to leave, and did not hear him speak. Arigato, for letting me know that. He then seemed to disappear by apparently phasing through the floor. Sona's office, 6 o'clock. You're telling me that the Ouroboros dragon goddess told you to take care of her new champion? That she appeared in your office at school, just shortly after he did? Do you know how crazy that sounds? Sotan, screamed the voice of Seraphol Leviathan. Both Sona and Amelia winced, while covering their ears to hopefully stop the ringing. After a few minutes of holding her ears, and then rubbing her temples, she responded. Hi, Ne-sama. She appeared after I resurrected him, and helped heal him somewhat. She continued rubbing her temples, trying to ease the headache that had hit her from Seraphol's shout. She seemed to transfer something into him. I can't tell if it was power, or something else. But I sensed it when she spoke to me. It was subtle, but she allowed me to sense it. Seraphol and Amelia nodded, though Amelia was also trying to stop a headache. After a moment, Sona was going to speak again, but was interrupted by Tsubaki walking into the office. Kaichu, Naruto has gone to explore Kuoh. I warned him about keeping his talents and extra appendages hidden, Tsubaki said, as she stepped up to the desk. Sona looked to her bishop and nodded. Arigato, Tsubaki. Did you also tell him about the other types of magic users that could show up? She asked. At the girl's negative shake of the head, she sighed. We'll get to that later. For now, I'll have my familiar follow him, to make sure nothing untoward happens. Tsubaki nodded and turned to leave. She was somewhat jealous, as she had never seen Sona's familiar, but cast that feeling aside. Of course, Kaichu. I will be going on my run now, good day, she said, as she left the office. Seraphol looked at Sona, with a twinkle in her eye. Yay, so Tan's calling mi. She kept staring at Sona, whose eyebrow twitched. Ne-sama, Sona sighed after a moment. That's not her name. Naruto appeared in an alleyway, close to the gate of Kuoh Academy. He paused for only a moment, having caught the scent of the young Nekosho through the hazy pollution of modern scents. The smell of exhaust fumes from the vehicles he saw on the street were a bit nauseating to his heightened sense of smell. He grumbled a little, and decided to focus on dampening the sense that was aggravating him a bit. After a few moments, he continued walking out of the alley. His first sight of Kuoh Academy made him sigh. It was still summer vacation, but he could see a few students and faculty moving on the grounds. Why'd I get the feeling that we are going to be stuck there for a while, Kurama? He mentally asked his tenant. The sound of her chuckle from the mindscape made him grimace. Probably because we will be, who knows, he sighed again, before he turned to head left. This is going to suck, he whispered, as he left the area that held the academy. He may have not minded learning, but he still hated being bored from classwork. As he continued mapping the city, he noticed a few things that made him sigh. The worst was, people were far more mob-like than they should be, far too socially interactive to pay attention to what was going on around them. And, another was, the amount of sexually explicit interactions in commercials. Or at least he thought they were explicit. Kurama, am I really seeing this? He mentally asked, after stopping near a park and seeing 3 teenage men spying on a group of girls that were enjoying a day at the park in summer clothes. Clothes that he could have sworn would be in one of Jiraiya's novels, if not a movie made by the same man. Kurama was silent for a few moments, but responded. Hi, Naruto-kun, please, beat those 3 as soon as you can, she said, with a pleading tone. They look like they might have some of the Toadman's influence. Naruto nodded, before one of them almost shouted about the amount of oppai he was seeing. No, they're worse. He would later learn that there was the internet as well. It was nearly noon when Naruto stopped exploring by walking in the crowds of the city, instead turning to the rooftops, as shinobi tended to do. Using mana, he influenced people to not even notice him and stayed out of camera view with his own skills. He even released the minor, though taxing, illusion on his new appendages and eyes. He paused on top of the local shopping mall, as he finally knew that whoever was following him was a non-threat. Whoever it is, needs to learn that completely suppressing their aura is a dead giveaway. She's been at it since 0800, he thought, before turning in the direction she was watching from. I was right, female, and those wings look like a crow's. He didn't even bother with waking Kurama up, not enough action for the kitsune to bother with. He raised his right hand and beckoned for the follower to speak. He smirked slightly when she hesitated, seemingly surprised that he knew she was following, so he spoke to her in a clear and authority's tone. You have been following me since this morning. I do not know why, but we will speak now. She seemed to blush at his voice, as most women did, and approached after a few moments. The first thing you should know, miss, is that completely suppressing your aura is a dead giveaway to any censor. They can feel the rift caused by doing so, almost like it's a void of energy. I suggest that when you next do that, to try and only limit the power outage to match your surroundings. He suggested in a cold and chiding type of tone. However, even that won't stop the best from sensing you. She frowned as she landed, having been following him by flying. He finally took notice of what she looked like. Her hair was long, and nearly as black as Sona's. Her eyes seemed to glow slightly in a pink and red color, almost turning purple at certain angles. Her outfit was strange, but not something he would glance twice at. She wore black shorts, with small pieces of dark gray armor going down the sides of her legs, and also over her crotch and lower abdomen. Her top was more of a bra, but also had the armor pieces covering her upper chest and her back. Pauldrons were draped over her shoulders, though he noticed that they allowed freedom of movement. She also wore a choker, as black as her outfit. Her footwear was just as black, and carried shin greaves to protect the lower legs. She also had a pair of bracers. They were the same color as the rest of the armor. Almost like Anbu gear, odd, he mentally concluded. It only took one glance for him to classify her as an assassin-type fighter. He smirked again at that. She knew that he had scoped her out with just a glance. It was something that she hoped to learn how to do. Classifying a fighter with just one glance was something only the most trained, or battle-hardened warriors and assassins learned. I suppose you are wondering why I am following you. She responded after a few minutes, trying to gauge his reaction to her presence. She tried to sense him in that time, but couldn't feel anything different between him and the surrounding area. Her voice sounded cold, yet he could feel a bit of nervousness in it. Not really, he responded, sounding as though he were bored. His eyes stared directly into hers, picking up a few facts that she was unable to hide in her eyes. There are many reasons that you could be following me. I just don't really care, at the moment. His eyes narrowed slightly, though she couldn't see it. Ophis, so that's the Ouroboros name for now. Definitely not a threat. She seemed to be shocked, for a small moment, but regained her composure. He spoke again, leaving her to wonder what he would do, while disappearing by seeming to phase into the ground. Tell yourself, and your mistress, what you will. It doesn't matter to me, as we will meet again at some point in time. Her eyes widened, at the stunt and the fact that she still couldn't tell if he was gone or not. She looked around quickly. After a few minutes, she took flight, being unable to find him. Not knowing where he went, or how. I need to contact Office-sama, she thought, before her eyes widened again. Mistress? Does he know who I follow? She asked herself, before nearly blasting off to get back to the ruined church. Naruto watched as the fallen angel left, having finally been able to know what she was. After she was gone for a few minutes, he stepped out of the wall near the roof access door. Fallen angel, following Office, the Ouroboros, and a group called the Chaos Brigade. He continued to watch the direction that she had disappeared in, for a few moments. He then turned and walked away, in the opposite direction. This requires more research, he said, before leaping towards the next roof. After a few minutes of leaping from roof to roof, he paused. Turning his head to the right, he saw a sweet shop just below. He also saw the Neko he had met, from Rias Gremory's peerage. Isn't that the one who is afraid of the sage arts? Came the voice of Kurama, even though only he could hear it. Indeed, Kura-chan. The one that we are supposed to help out, in order for Sona to have this territory under her complete control. He responded mentally, and then grimaced as he remembered the other part of the deal. As well as the other part, I can't believe that they use arranged marriages like that. It is disgraceful. Kurama hummed in agreement. True, the elemental nations stopped doing that a few decades ago. Even the royalty said no more. She then sent him a mental nudge, to speak with the young Neko. She might be able to give us a proper tour. Though, she doesn't seem talkative. Naruto nodded and leapt to the ground, after hiding his kitsune features again. He landed silently, not even getting the attention of those who were walking by, and proceeded to cross the street towards the shop. He read the sign of the shop's name, before entering. There were a few differences in the languages of his world in Japan, though it was only the written aspect. Arikado's Sweets was written on the sign, or at least, that was what he could catch. The aroma of the shop was strange to him, as he hadn't spent much time in sweet shops before. His heightened sense of smell caught so many scents from the shop, that it nearly made his eyes water. The town's smells also did this, but it wasn't as bad due to the open air. Welcome, young man. What can I get for you? Came the voice of the young shop owner. Naruto guessed that he was in his mid-20s. The man's hair was a light black, while his eyes were a near gold color. His facial features were of a type of aristocrat, while his skin was pale. His voice was lighter than average, and he seemed to prefer speaking softly. Naruto approached the counter, taking a quick sweeping glance around at the products. Not sure yet, I stepped inside to speak with an acquaintance. He paused after saying that, finally close enough to catch the man's scent. Half human, but the other scent. From the corner of his eye, he saw Kaneko turn when she heard his voice. The shop owner nodded, before returning to making sweets. Just holler if you want anything. Naruto nodded as he turned to walk towards Kaneko. Arigato, he said, after a few steps. Kaneko Taju sighed lightly, as she ate a slice of strawberry cheesecake in her favorite sweet shop. The shop owner had been in business for a few months, when she stumbled across it nearly a year before. She knew that the owner was a Dampier, much like Gasper. Though she could tell he was far more used to putting his life on the line than Gasper could. The young bishop of her king was still far too much of a reclusive, frightened child. She still grumbled those words privately after spending some time working with said child. Her sigh, however, was for the book she had been absorbed in for the past day. If Nei-chan didn't really go mad with power, then what happened? She mentally questioned herself. She had already read half of the tome, and the information drew some concern. Though, the info wasn't as concerning as her current thoughts. The door opened, after Arikado had placed another slice in front of her and moved back to the counter. The shop didn't normally draw in a lot of customers at this time of day, but some would straggle in at even more odd hours. Her eyes narrowed as the new person spoke, and she turned to see the new queen of Lady Sona's peerage. She also caught the feeling that an alpha predator was inside. Though the energy was masked, she could still feel it. Her eyes widened slightly as he turned towards her, and approached at a relaxed gait. Fancy meeting you here, young one. His voice carried across the small distance between them, sounding almost like the promise of honey being delivered at no cost. She wouldn't tell anyone, but her sweet tooth would make her add honey to a glass of milk at times. His voice sounded even better, but her reference was the closest she could get to explaining just how nice it sounded. His words weren't loud, like most people his age were. In fact, only those who were serious in life could match the near silence that he spoke with, people like Sona. Or even Sirzex, when the brother of her king wasn't being his normal cis-con self. She watched as he approached at such a leisurely pace, almost seeming to slow down as he got closer. But then again, time seemed to stall to her senses as he got closer to her. I hope I am not intruding, but I saw you here whilst exploring the town and decided to stop in, he said, though it took a moment for her to process the words. His power may be matching the surroundings, but Nekosho could still feel the presence of sages. She nodded and returned her attention to her snack, though he could tell that she was nervous. You are unsettled by my presence, he said after a few minutes, with a sigh. You need not be so, even if you do not like to talk. I will not attack you. She gazed at him as he sat down across from her. She turned her gaze downwards, not sure why she felt strange from his presence, but she knew that it caused her heart to skip a few beats. Would it help if I gave you my weapons for this meeting, young one? She nearly winced at his question, but looked back at him. No, you don't need to, she said after a few moments, noticing just how relaxed he was. She knew that he wouldn't even need claws to slit her throat, which still made her feel strange, yet it wasn't in a bad way, she decided later. Very well, young one. Allow me to finally introduce myself. I am Naruto, of the clans Uzumaki and Namikaze. He bowed his head slightly, as was the formal greeting and introduction whilst sitting. She didn't know of those two clans, which took her a moment to see if she remembered those two names, but introduced herself as well. Kaneko, of an unknown clan, formerly Sharon, of an unknown clan. I now consider my clan to be Teju. She didn't know why she had given the name that her sister once called her by, but she had a feeling it was proper. He nodded, and turned his gaze to look out the window. An abandoned. That doesn't normally happen, but I suppose that one of only two Nekosho wouldn't be able to learn of her history very easily. His words were spoken, as though he were talking to himself, but he did catch her slow nod. They sat there for a while, chatting only a little every few minutes. As the time wore on, Kaneko felt more relaxed around him. After an hour, he stood once more. Well, Miss Kaneko, this meeting has been pleasant, but I must return to my exploration of this town, he said, turning to leave. Kaneko looked up, and for a moment, she fought with herself. She then stood, as he reached the door to the shop. I'll give you a tour, she said, quickly paying for her snacks, before then following him. I thank you, that would be most helpful, he said, and held the door open for her. Kuoh Mall, 1300, here is the mall, the town's main shopping center, Kaneko said, as she finished off the tour for Naruto. They stood on top of the bookstore across from the main mall. Most of the mall was owned by the Gremory family, but more than a few stores were owned by Sona herself, including the one they stood on. I must thank you again, Kaneko. You have helped me gain a better understanding of the territory, Naruto said with gratitude, before he turned to her. He noticed that she was still slightly distraught, but he could tell that it wasn't so much his presence that caused it. Kurama, can you catch the reason for her nerves? He mentally asked his tenant. Kurama hummed for a moment, gazing through his eyes to read the energy he was looking at from the Neko. It looks like it is a personal subject, as well as the book you gave her, though, I can't say for sure without getting a better read in person. Kurama replied, before thinking for another moment. Maybe you could offer your help in understanding of chakra and the sage arts? After all, that is one of the jobs for Sona to hold this territory. Naruto nodded mentally, and turned back in the direction Kaneko was looking. He trusted the yokai's words, though he felt a small bit of caution at all times. She might be right, it'll put me in better standing anyways, he thought, after silencing his connection with Kurama. In repayment for this, I would like to offer you something, Kaneko, he said after a few moments of thinking. He turned back to the Neko. I offer proper tutoring in the ways of senjutsu, as well as theory of chakra itself. Kaneko stiffened slightly, but turned to him. Will you accept? He asked after a few minutes, though continued with a few more words. You do not need to answer now, but I hope you think about it. He watched her gaze at his face, for a few more minutes. Kaneko was trying to see if he was telling the truth, though she noticed that reading him was next to impossible. I would like to think about it, she said, and nearly sighed in relief at his nod. As you wish. In the meantime, allow me to escort you back to the school. It is the height of rudeness to allow a young lady to walk by herself, when she is in thoughts that are so. He paused for a thought on what word he should use. Vexing, to the ability to pay attention to one's surroundings. Kaneko nodded. After a few more minutes, she turned to the school, and leapt from the bookstore's roof. He followed, only a few nanoseconds behind her. Their walk to the school wasn't long, but it was in silence that seemed to stretch out time for the young Neko. She still felt like there was a true predator next to her, yet something else was niggling her senses about him. You do realize that she is torn on what to feel around you, right? Kurama's voice sounded through their bond. He almost chuckled out loud, but responded through the connection. Of course, she feels like I am an alpha predator. Yet also feels like I am trying to guard her from something. Kurama huffed. And how the fuck do you know that? He slightly smirked, and showed her an image of him tapping his nose. I learned quite a bit more about sense on the field than we took notice of originally. He then stopped, as he and Kaneko arrived at Kuoh Academy. We will converse later, we are being watched. He turned to Kaneko, and properly bowed to her. I once again thank you, Kaneko, for the tour. I hope you have a pleasant day. He then stood and turned slightly, to notice Rias Gremory watching from the old school building he had seen when he was here last. Kaneko nodded, before she turned to head towards the Occult Research Club. She didn't notice her king watching her with a frown. Sona's Manor office, June 21, 1430. Sona sighed as she laid her pen down, having just completed glossing over the missive from Lord Lucifer whilst taking notes on everything she could find in it. It wasn't the full document, which would be delivered to her later, so she couldn't read everything she needed about it at that time. This is only the general overview. Serafal knows that I hate not having the full documents before me. Still, this had to be done quickly. Mother said that Riser-san has been far pushier about the betrothal lately. She thought, before her eyes looked up to the office door as it opened. She saw Naruto enter, turned to close the door, and then headed towards the bookshelves to the right of the room. She watched as he scoured the shelves, and took a few books that were in the history section. She knew which books he had grabbed, knowing the layout of her office as personally as her own room, before he approached a desk near one of the windows on the same side. The books were on the most recent history of the world and of Japan, concerning both the human history and the supernatural. She continued to watch him for a few moments, noticing how quickly he was able to read and take notes on a pad of paper he had pulled from somewhere along with his own pen. She didn't know that he knew her gaze was on him, but after a few minutes she turned back to look over the small missive again. She wouldn't notice until 2 days later, that he wouldn't even sleep whilst researching about the history of this world. It would cause her some concern when she did. Sona's office, June 23, 9 o'clock. Naruto sighed, as he closed another book on history. He had finally gotten to the point of the First World War in it, not even bothering with the fact that he was slightly tired. You've been at it for over 3 days, Naruto-kun, Kurama said, in a light scolding tone. You still aren't recovered enough for such activities. You need to rest more than normal, as not even I can keep your body going after that dimensional hop we were thrown through. Naruto chuckled and stood, after nodding his head. He didn't make it far, as only a few steps later he felt his knees nearly give out. Alright, you are correct, Kura-chan. Might as well just crash in the chair, as I doubt my chakra will let me abuse it for energy right now. He heard no reply to his thoughts, as he was too tired to even use the connection properly for mental speech. Kurama was only able to hear the first sentence of his thought, but knew why it closed. She cursed him, but didn't even bother keeping her own end open for him to hear. It was only a few moments later that Naruto fell into a sleep that wouldn't fully do as it was supposed to. 30 minutes later, the office door opened and both Sona and Tsubaki entered the office. Upon noticing Naruto, Tsubaki tensed slightly, before she asked her king a question that would make Sona think for a moment. He's still in here, does he sleep in rooms full of books? I did notice that he was here all night yesterday. I'll have to check if he left last night. Sona thought, before opened her connection to the barriers of the manor. After a few seconds she sighed, and turned to Tsubaki. He hasn't even slept since he awoke from his coma. Only those like Serafal could do that while being in a weakened state. But she could only go for a full 48 hours in such a state. She started to chew on her bottom lip for a moment, before speaking again. That will be all, Tsubaki. I can handle the paperwork for today, she said in a dismissal type of tone, before she walked to her desk. Tsubaki nearly froze, but nodded after a moment and turned to leave. She did cast one last glance at the sleeping blonde, before she opened the door and left. Sona sat in her chair and opened the folder that contained the papers she would need to get Naruto into the academy she headed. She then sighed after a few minutes of checking over it all. At least this isn't very difficult, she said before she turned to Naruto, and noticed him sleeping in the same chair that he sat in nearly 2 days before. That reminds me of a few years ago. I was always passing out in our library from overindulging myself in research. I wonder, is he like me in that regard? She thought, for a few moments. She twitched slightly in arousal at the thought that he would study so much, as she always valued intellect. She then heard the voice of Kurama through the bond she held with him. He normally does this for a few weeks straight, while being able to go just as long without the need for sleep that he requires right now. The kitsune responded to her mental question. I apologize for intruding your thoughts, but he needs far more rest than he normally does. The jump through dimensions was harder on his body than it should have been. Kurama said, before going quiet. Sona thought for a few minutes more, before her gaze turned back to the paperwork on her desk. Does he really spend so much time researching things? She mentally asked, though she didn't send the question telepathically. She had learned quite a bit about mana, even going through a few ancient tomes about mind-based magic, though there wasn't much knowledge about that. Maybe he knows more about it. I'll have to figure out just how much he knows, she finally thought. After a near half hour, she had been thinking about far more than that, while still filling out the few papers needed to enroll her new queen piece. She didn't pay enough attention to notice that Naruto had moved to be behind her right shoulder. She nearly jumped when he finally spoke. Is this my cover? His question was asked in a nearly cold type of deadpan tone. She turned towards him, and he noticed her eyes were widened at the small scare he unintentionally gave her. He sighed slightly, not even making much sound as he did so, before he decided to give her a small piece of advice. You will need to get used to that, Sona. I was raised in the shadows, trained to fight in war and assassinate. To spy, and to steal secrets, as well as artifacts and currency from the enemies of my home. To torture and interrogate information from those who held it, and to trade in knowledge and information that many wouldn't even place in their black books. His words were said in a tone that sounded like a veteran to her, someone who had seen the darkest reaches that sentient beings could delve into. The shadows are my realm, places to travel through, and lie in wait for the perfect moment to strike. To reap their souls, before they could even learn about my existence or presence. They are my realm to play in, as well as my most trusted ally. He then turned his gaze to directly stare into her eyes. You must get used to me showing up like this, fairly often, as most other modes of transportation are either too noisy, or they take too damn long. He turned back to the papers that she had been working on, as she thought about his words. Great, he owes you another dance, Kura-chan. You were right, he mentally said to the Kyuubi, that normally gambled with Naruto in strange ways to get rid of her boredom. The clone heard his tenet cackle through their own bond, and instead focused more on the papers before Sona. Vice President, okay, he thought after a few moments of reading what she had applied him for. He stopped afterwards, and moved to stand before her. I suppose that it will do. As long as I am near you at all times during this, it will make my new job easier, he said, before going silent. He stood before the desk for 20 minutes, as Sona finished the paperwork and then turned to him. She gazed at his goggled eyes for a few more minutes, before she spoke to him. You will be my right hand, in both the school we are to attend, and in my normal duties concerning the underworld. Tsubaki is my normal secretary in running the academy, though you will be taking her place after being taught how. You may find this a bit more. He raised his hand, stopping her. I know how to run an academy, Sona. I will just need to research more about the subjects that I am expected to attend during the usual school hours. He then sighed again, this time clearly enough for her to catch. And please, don't ever use the word normal, I find it to be a word that defies its own definition, he said, gaining a nod from her, as well as a small smile. She turned back to the papers in front of her, but stopped as she noticed Naruto was still in the chair at the desk he was reading at. She turned back to the one before her, and narrowed her eyes before switching between the two for a few moments. After a minute, she noticed the Naruto before her smirk. Mind telling me how there are two of you, when I can only sense one? She asked in a slow tone. The Naruto before her chuckled slightly, and turned to the blonde who was still asleep at the desk. A special technique, the boss mastered a long time ago. Where he is from, he was known as the Walking Army, the Legion of the Forest. For he is many, yet he is also one. The Cage Bunshin technique creates a clone made of chakra, and a small piece of his own soul. This makes us, the clones, capable of gathering intelligence for him and giving the memories back when we dispel. The clone sighed for a second. Though, that was only his public persona for our last mission. Sona turned back to the one who was asleep. So, he will know about this paperwork, and conversation when he wakes? She asked. At the clone's nod, she asked another question. A small piece of his soul, does that mean that he will gain it back when you are gone? The clone nodded again, and she chewed on her lip again slightly. The clone turned back to her, and gazed at her face for a moment. It is a type of conjuration, chakra and mana split, memory and mind split, and very minor soul-splitting technique. However, it also halves your power by every clone you create, normally. The clone then conjured a chair, and sat down. The boss, or the creator as some of us will call him, is capable of making us by the thousands, and he won't be winded at all. But, the hop between worlds did far more damage to him than you realize. Right now, he can only make two, before succumbing to exhaustion, or at least be winded like an average person when running for a few miles. Sona's eyes widened slightly, and she stared back at the real Naruto. Thousands. When she heard the clone chuckle, she turned back to him. As I said, a legion. His response almost floored her, but she caught herself enough to return to the pages in front of her, and she put them in the folder once more. You said that you have memories. Does this mean I could ask a clone about his past? She asked, and looked back up at him. The clone seemed to think for a moment, and nodded. I see, that might be helpful. She whispered, knowing that the clone could hear her. Tsubaki had only been gone for a few hours, before she returned to the library of the manor. When she stepped in again, she noticed Naruto still asleep in the chair he had procured. She then turned her gaze to Sona's desk, and stopped. What the hell? She screamed in her own mind. She saw Sona conversing with another Naruto, and her king was in thought for a moment before speaking to the awake blonde. Tsubaki turned her head to look at the blonde who was asleep, before turning back to the main desk. She paused for a second, and then cast her own sense of mana throughout the room. Tsubaki only felt that there was one Naruto in the entire mansion, yet she could clearly see two. She then heard a chuckle from Sona's desk. You won't be able to sense us, as we are connected to the Creator by the small piece of soul that he created us with. We are true clones, and the only way you can tell that we are here is when the boss is far away from us. Naruto's voice said to her from Sona's desk. Sona smirked at her, before bidding her to step forth. What can you tell me, Tsubaki? Tsubaki stepped up to the desk, and laid an envelope on the desk. The Phoenix clan has sent us this missive. They are claiming that they will follow Lord Lucifer's decree, but that Riser may dismiss it. She then sighed, and opened the folder to the last page. Lady Phoenix also sent a letter. She claims that Ravel has left Riser's peerage, and is thinking of coming her for sanctuary. Sona raised an eyebrow, and cast her gaze to the clone of her new queen. So, Riser's sister has finally seen the depths of his depravity? She turned back to her. Bishop. Does Lady Phoenix say anything else? Tsubaki nodded. She says that if Riser breaks this decree, he will be disowned. Lord Phoenix agreed, after Lord Lucifer met with him. She then sighed, before continuing. His health has taken a drastic turn, and Ruvel has been found. Sona frowned, before reaching for the folder. She read the letter, and then turned the pages to read the entire missive. It's not just that they found him, she said, after a few minutes of flipping through the pages, but they found his corpse. She sighed, and looked to Naruto's clone. Light magic residue is all that remains in the wound. Headless, and without any mana to cast a burning resurrection. His wife and child also suffered, though young Elizabeth was also raped. The clone hummed for a moment, before turning to the sleeping Naruto. The clone scoffed, and disappeared in a small explosion of smoke. Just enough to see an outline of where the body once was, before that too disappeared. A groan was heard from the now awake queen. Are you telling me that you want to offer sanctuary to the sister of the dipshit we must keep away from the town? He asked, before standing and turning to them after a yawn. Sona nodded, and levitated the folder to him. Ravel is the best of the two remaining children of Clan Phoenix. It is more than likely that she will soon be the heir of the Earl seat of Phoenix. She then opened a drawer, and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. Pulling 3 glasses to her, she filled them with a small amount, and then grabbed a bottle of something else that Naruto hadn't seen before, and poured it into the glasses as well. She then stirred them using mana, and levitated 2 of the glasses to her peerage members. Tsubaki took a sip, and sighed. This brightens my day a little, she said, and sat in the second chair before Sona's desk. Naruto took a taste from his own glass, hummed in appreciation, and then stepped to the chair that his clone disappeared from. He quickly read through the 30-page missive, and then the letter. You do realize that it may be necessary for us to go to their home. If this Lord Phoenix is actually sick, then we cannot leave poison out of the equation. If their usual is to burn poison out of their system, much like a phoenix, then there are only 1 or 2 poisonous plants that can do this type of damage. Sona raised her eyebrow again, before casting her eyes upwards to the ceiling. Or holy water, though, that would require a light-based person to use properly. Naruto raised his own eyebrow, but said nothing as Sona continued thinking for a moment. We will go to the ancestral Phoenix Manor, and see what we can find there. If Riser tries to break the decree, we may have to fight our way out of there. Sona said, after turning her gaze back to them. Finish your drinks, and then alert Momo. Tsubaki. We leave in 30 minutes. Tsubaki nodded, and then emptied her glass by consuming it quickly. She then stood and left the library, to find the other newest member of Sona's peerage. Naruto watched the glass that Tsubaki left behind and sighed, before throwing his own drink down his throat in the same way. I'll be ready in a moment. he said, before seeming to disappear from before Sona's desk. Sona watched as he vanished, and turned to look at the glass and folder he left on her desk. She then sighed, and looked at her own glass of vodka and whiskey. This will burn, she said, before draining her own glass as quickly as the other two did before leaving. She then stood, with a minor grimace, and made her way to the door. Sona's Manor entrance hall, 12:45. Naruto stood in the entrance hall, waiting for the others to arrive. His outfit was the same that he had worn for the last 2 days, but his weapon had changed. He now wore a 6-foot-long greatsword on his back, single-edged, and nearly half a foot from spine to edge. It was a bright blue color, with the edge being darker and seemed to make one feel as though ice were about to encase those it would cut. "It's been a while since you last used this sword, Naruto-kun," Kurama said through the mind link they shared. "As I recall, it was when a certain bird gave you problems." She finished speaking, and Naruto smirked at her words. He chuckled as he recalled the summon he faced when Jiraiya was on one of his intelligence-gathering episodes. "Hi, a damn phoenix too." He heard her chuckle as well, before she went silent. He knew she was replaying that battle in her mind, and recalled how many times he had cut it down before using the sword he had resting on his right shoulder. The collateral damage from that fight was massive, but nowhere near the amount of his fight with Kagaya, or even Madara. He straightened his back more, as he heard the others arrive. He noticed Sona pause for a moment, and blush as she looked at his sword. She can sense its ability, well then, definitely an ice mage, he thought, and heard Kurama hum in agreement. Momo was staring at his sword, before she looked away blushing slightly. She stayed silent, and fidgeted a little while his tails were glanced at every few seconds. He heard his tenant chuckle at that, before he looked at Tsubaki with a glance. She wore her usual summer outfit, a business-like suit that was gray, with a lighter gray skirt that had black stripes. A light pink button-up shirt with a black tie, her usual glasses, white socks and gray shoes. But what really caught his eye was the long naginata she carried. Its long shaft was a bright red, with gold inlays that painted a near waterfall-like image running from the blade to the pommel of the shaft. The blade was a bit larger than the usual naginata he had seen, and had bright silver kanji along it. A quick reading of them gave him the meaning of them on the weapon. Unbreakable, never dull, and mana distribution, all arrayed like a seal around the kanji for fire. No, that won't work. Unless if his slaves are weak to the fire element. He looked directly into Tsubaki's eyes and spoke. "I commend your choice of weapon, but the element in its use will not help you." The other three raised an eyebrow, or at least all but Momo. She only looked confused, and then noticed Tsubaki carrying the naginata. Her eyes widened slightly, before turning back to Naruto. "What do you mean, Naruto?" Sona asked, before turning her gaze to the naginata that rested in Tsubaki's hand. She looked closely at the weapon, and could not see anything wrong with it. Tsubaki also looked at him, before he explained. "The blade has silver kanji, that paint an elemental seal into the weapon. It is fire-based, so if she pushes mana through it, the blade will light on fire. The silver gives it a small advantage of use against undead, while turning the flames to be a bit more divine against them. Though it will only work on the undead, and against those who are cursed with lycanthrope." He sighed, before turning to Sona. "Its divine aspect won't work against us, unless it was cooled with holy water. And it is old, not carrying much power on its own, and not young enough to have a connection to the church you have told me about. It will not break, or get dull, but the elemental aspect of it will not work against the Phoenix clan." Tsubaki grimaced, and turned to look away from him for a moment, while Sona nodded with a thoughtful mien in her eyes. "I can offer you one that may work against them, should a fight break out, though it won't last forever," he said, gaining the attention of Tsubaki once more. Sona raised an eyebrow again, and looked at Tsubaki before turning back to him. "If we are forced to fight, then by all means do so. Though I must ask about that blade you have now. Why does it feel like a blizzard is about to happen, just from looking at it?" Naruto smirked, before taking the blade from his shoulder and placing it before him. The edge facing to his left, and appearing to darken to a near midnight blue. This sword is an ancient relic, made from adamantium, and cooled in the coldest springs of the land of snow. Made for a Ronin, who had saved the country long ago from a great beast that nearly destroyed the land with fire. He sighed slightly, and cast his eyes upon the edge. His glasses were missing right then, and the three ladies noticed his eyes brighten slightly at the explanation. "Enchanted with the ancient powers of ice spirits, it will freeze all that it slices. Even the flames of Uchiha Madara would not be able to stop it, and he was the best fire user in the elemental nations. His majestic flame destroyer was capable of igniting a quarter of the world, turning part of the planet into the deepest and hottest pits of Makai. His eyes then turned up to them, and they noticed a glimmer of mania in them. He was a tough bitch, due to his power, skill, and brilliance on the battlefield. Momo gulped, and asked the question all three of them had on their minds: "Did you fight him?" He smiled, and his eyes seemed to cast a brighter glance of insanity. Even if it was only temporary. "Hi, killing him was a pain. But the fight made me feel alive, in a way that only the end of a planet can make you feel." When he fully resurrected, and absorbed the Shinju, he easily reached God class. Kagaya was more powerful than him, but she wasn't a real fighter. Momo gulped again and looked to Sona, who sighed, "Enough, we leave now." The king then cast her circle, to transport them to the underworld. The underworld, Phoenix Manor Gate, 1300. They arrived at the gates to Phoenix Manor, though many would claim that it is a castle. The four approached the gate, noticing that many devils were there. Naruto had already placed the sword on his shoulder again, and glanced around the courtyard. His eyes narrowed, and his ears twitched at the sounds of music and conversation reaching across it. "Of course, a party is going on," Tsubaki said, with sarcasm clearly being broadcast through her voice. Naruto sighed after her words. XXX the end.